first gunshot did not sound like violence. It sounded like a champagne cork in the rain. Mara Dumaine flinched beside her husband's coffin, one black-gloved hand gripping the edge of the polished mahogany casket, while the priest's prayer broke in half. A flock of birds exploded from the live oaks above Lafayette Cemetery, scattering through the gray New Orleans morning like ash shaken from heaven. No one screamed. That was what frightened her most. The men around her, the strangers in black suits who had been pretending to mourn a man she had loved for 9 months and buried after 10, only turned their heads with the smooth, synchronized calm of soldiers hearing a familiar command. Their hands moved under their jackets, their eyes went to the cemetery gates. Mara's veil stuck to her lips. Rain slid down the netting over her face, blurring the white tombs, the marble angels, the priest's trembling fingers, the lilies wilting in silver stands. Then the black SUVs arrived. One after another, they rolled to the cemetery entrance like a funeral procession for something much worse than death. Their doors opened in perfect silence. Men stepped out carrying umbrellas, scanning rooftops, iron gates, mausoleum shadows. And then he appeared. He was tall, dressed in a black coat cut with brutal elegance, with dark hair slicked back from a face too controlled to belong to any grieving man. White roses hung from his left hand, their stems wrapped in black silk. No one introduced him. No one had to. The priest lowered his Bible. Mara heard one of her dead husband's business partners whisper, "Moretti." That single name chilled the cemetery more than the rain. Cassian Moretti. The man every dock worker, shipping broker, casino owner, corrupt councilman, and riverfront police captain in New Orleans feared enough to never say his name above a whisper. The man Mara had seen once from across a restaurant 6 months earlier, when her husband had gone pale, paid the check without eating, and told her they were leaving through the kitchen. Now that man walked toward her husband's coffin, with white roses and murder in his eyes. Mara's pulse slammed so hard she could barely breathe. Her husband, Theo Dumaine, had told her he was a shipping consultant, a quiet businessman, a man with old family money and a tired smile. He had taught her how to dance badly in the kitchen. He had left handwritten notes in her coffee cups. He had called her Moonlight when he thought she was asleep. Now a mafia boss was standing at his funeral. Cassian stopped on the opposite side of the casket. The cemetery seemed to kneel around him. His gaze touched the coffin first. No emotion crossed his face, but something in the muscles of his jaw tightened, as if grief had put a blade there. Then his eyes lifted to Mara. They were not black, as rumors said. They were a deep, merciless green, the color of the Mississippi under storm clouds. For a breath, he only looked at her, at the widow in the black dress, at the woman who did not belong among these men with hidden weapons and dead eyes. At the wedding ring on her finger, the one Theo had slipped there under a courthouse fluorescent light because he said he could not wait another day. Cassian's stare moved to that ring. The air changed. "You are Mara," he said. His voice was calm, low, more dangerous because it did not need to rise. Mara's throat tightened. "You shouldn't be here." A faint, humorless curve touched his mouth. "No one alive tells me where I should be. I'm burying my husband." His eyes sharpened. "No, you're burying a lie." The words struck harder than the gunshot. Mara stepped back from the coffin, but there were men behind her. Theo's men, or Cassian's men, or men who had never belonged to either of them and were simply waiting to see which king survived the morning. Cassian laid the white roses on the coffin lid. Mara looked at his hand. A tattoo disappeared beneath his cuff, black ink over old scars, a crescent and a broken crown. She had seen that mark before, not on him. In Theo's old leather journal, hidden inside the lining of his suitcase. Beneath the drawing, Theo had written one name, Rafael. Mara did not know why she said it. Maybe grief broke the careful part of her. Maybe terror turned memory into instinct. Maybe the dead still had power over the living, and Theo, buried inches away from her hands, forced the truth out of her mouth. She looked into the feared mafia boss's eyes and whispered, Rafael. The name did not echo. It detonated. Cassian Moretti went completely still. Every man around them reached for a weapon. The priest crossed himself. For the first time since he arrived, the Mafia boss lost control of his face. It was only a fracture. 1 second of naked shock breaking through the ice. But Mara saw it. She saw the boy under the monster, the ghost under the king. His eyes burned into hers. "What did you say?" Mara swallowed. Theo had that name written down. Cassian moved before she could blink. He gripped her arm, not hard enough to hurt, but with a finality that told her resisting would be pointless. "Lock the gates," he ordered. The cemetery erupted into motion. Black-suited men spread through the tombs. Iron gates clanged shut. Engines growled. A woman near the back began to cry. Someone cursed in Italian. Someone else shouted that he had rights. Cassian ignored all of it. He pulled Mara away from the coffin. She twisted in his grip. "Let me go. Not while half this cemetery wants you dead. My husband is in that coffin." His head turned toward her, rain darkening his hair, his expression carved from stone. "Your husband is the reason they came." Another shot cracked through the cemetery. This time, people screamed. A marble angel above the family tomb shattered, white stone exploding over the mourners. Cassian shoved Mara behind him so fast her back hit his chest. His arm came around her waist, iron and heat, his body a wall between her and the bullet's path. For 1 terrifying second, she felt his breath against her ear. "Stay down," he said. "I don't take orders from you. You will today." He dragged her through the chaos, past overturned flower stands, and men drawing pistols beneath umbrellas. Rain hammered the cemetery. The world became black coats, white tombs, gunmetal, and Cassian's hand locked around hers. Mara looked back once. Theo's coffin sat alone beneath the live oaks, white roses bleeding rainwater over the lid. Then Cassian forced her into the back of an armored SUV, climbed in after her, and slammed the door. The glass was dark. The locks clicked. Mara slapped his hand when he reached for her seatbelt. "Don't touch me," he paused. Not because she frightened him, because something in her defiance interested him. "Your pulse is racing," he said. "My husband was just shot at during his own funeral." "No." Cassian leaned closer, his voice still controlled. "You were." The SUV lurched forward. Outside, men shouted, and cemetery walls slid past in streaks of gray. Mara stared at him, rainwater dripping from her veil onto her mouth. Who was Theo? Cassian's expression closed. "That," he said, "is the question that may get you killed." The car sped through New Orleans like the city itself had become an enemy. Mara watched the French Quarter blur beyond bulletproof glass, iron balconies dripping rain, neon signs glowing weakly through the morning storm, tourists pressed beneath awnings with coffee cups and phones, never knowing that a widow in the back of a black SUV was being stolen from her own funeral. Cassian sat across from her instead of beside her. It should have made her feel safer. It did not. He took up too much space without moving. His coat was open now, revealing a black suit, a white shirt, and the edge of ink climbing his throat. There was no visible weapon on him, which made her more certain he had several. Mara pulled off her wet veil and crushed it in her lap. "You kidnapped me. I saved you. You locked down my husband's funeral. I kept the shooters from finishing their work. They were shooting because you came." Cassian's eyes lifted. "They were shooting because you are alive." The words slid under her skin. She hated that he said them gently. Mara looked away first. She had not slept in 3 days. She had spent those days choosing flowers, signing death certificates, listening to strangers offer condolences with eyes that measured the rooms of her house. She had believed grief was the worst thing that could happen to a person. Now grief seemed almost clean compared to fear. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Cassian reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a folded document sealed in plastic. He tossed it onto the leather seat between them. Mara did not touch it. "What is that?" "Your inheritance." "I don't have an inheritance. You own Dumaine Maritime Holdings." She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Theo owned a consulting firm with 1 office, and a receptionist named Paula, who never remembered my birthday. Theo owned 31% of the Gulf Corridor shipping contracts, 6 shell companies, 3 private terminals, and a legal route through the port that every crime family in the South has tried to buy for 12 years. Mara's mouth went dry. That's not possible. It is now yours. No. She shook her head. No, I would have known. Would you? The question was cruel, because it was fair. Theo had kept locked rooms, long phone calls, sudden trips. He had smiled whenever she asked, kissed her forehead, and told her the shipping business was boring enough to kill romance. She had believed him because loving someone sometimes meant accepting the version of peace they offered. Cassian watched understanding wound her. His face did not soften, but his voice changed by a degree. He married you quickly because he was running out of time. Mara's ring felt suddenly heavy. You're lying. I wish I were. Why? She demanded. Why would you care? If my husband was part of your world, why weren't you at our wedding? Why didn't he ever say your name? Why did you look like you hated him when you walked up to that coffin? Cassian's gaze went to the rain streaking down the window. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, because 15 years ago, Theo Dumaine helped bury Rafael Delacroix. Mara's breath caught. The forgotten name sat between them like a loaded gun. That was you. Cassian's eyes returned to hers. That boy is dead. You reacted when I said his name. I reacted because no one who says it lives long. Mara should have been afraid of that sentence. She was. But she was also furious. My husband wrote that name in his journal. He drew your tattoo. He kept a photograph of 2 boys on a dock. She leaned forward, grief turning reckless. One of them was him. One of them was you. So don't sit there and tell me he was just some liar unless you're ready to tell me what he was to you. For the first time, Cassian did not answer quickly. The SUV passed under an overpass, shadows sliding over his face. He was my brother, he said. Mara stopped breathing. Not by blood, his silence said. By something older, stronger. Chosen in the brutal way children choose family when adults leave them to starve. Cassian looked out the window again, shutting the crack before she could see through it. And then, he added, he became my betrayer. The safe house did not look like a safe house. It looked like a Garden District mansion old enough to have secrets in the walls, with white columns, black shutters, and wrought iron balconies veiled in rain. 2 guards stood beneath the porch lamps. Cameras hid in the gas lanterns. The hedges were trimmed too perfectly, leaving no place for a person to hide. Cassian got out first. Mara waited for someone to open her door, then changed her mind and pushed it open herself. A guard reached to help her. She ignored him and stepped into the rain. Cassian noticed. His gaze lowered to her bare hand, trembling despite her effort to hide it. He said nothing. He only removed his coat and placed it over her shoulders. Mara froze under the unexpected weight of it. It was warm. It smelled faintly of cedar, smoke, and rain. I said don't touch me, she murmured. I didn't. You covered me. You're shaking. I'm angry. You can be both. She wanted to throw the coat at him. Instead, because she was freezing and exhausted, and not nearly as unbreakable as she wished, she pulled it tighter around herself. His eyes followed the movement. Something like satisfaction crossed his face, gone before she could name it. Inside, the mansion was dim and beautiful. Marble floors, oil paintings, fresh flowers, antique mirrors reflecting men with guns. It was a palace pretending not to be a fortress. Cassian led her into a library with dark wood shelves and a fire burning low in the hearth. A silver tray waited with coffee, tea, and a bottle of bourbon. Someone had prepared for her arrival. That frightened her more than if the room had been empty. How long have you known I'd come here? Mara asked. Cassian removed his gloves finger by finger. Since your husband died. You mean since he was murdered? His hands paused. Mara stepped closer. Was he? The fire cracked. Cassian looked at one of his men. Leave us. The guards exited without argument. When the doors closed, the quiet was worse than the weapons. Cassian walked to the desk and pressed a button beneath the edge. A screen rose from the polished wood, showing grainy security footage. A narrow street. Theo's car. A burst of headlights. A truck sliding from an alley. Mara's stomach turned. No, she whispered. The truck hit Theo's car at full speed. Metal folded. Glass became rain. The footage ended before the worst of it, but Mara's body already knew. She reached for the desk and missed. Cassian was there before she fell. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her without pulling her close. Controlled, careful, as if he had trained himself not to want too much. Mara yanked away the moment she found balance. You had this, and didn't give it to the police? His eyes were hard. Half the police report to Celeste Varro. Who is that? The woman who ordered it. The name meant nothing and everything. Mara had heard it once at a gala Theo refused to attend. Celeste Varro, owner of luxury hotels, charity boards, private museums. A woman photographed in ivory silk beside governors and archbishops. She killed Theo? She tried to kill him. Then she succeeded. Why? Cassian turned the screen off. Because he changed his will. Mara felt the room tilt again. Cassian opened a folder and slid papers toward her. 3 weeks before his death, Theo transferred controlling authority of Dumaine Maritime to you upon his death. No board approval needed, no family override, no buyer can acquire the terminals without your signature. Mara stared at the legal language, her name appearing again and again like it belonged to someone else. Mara Dumaine shall retain full executive voting authority. She looked up. I run a restoration studio. I repair water-damaged books. I don't know anything about ports. That is why everyone wants you. For my signature. For your obedience. Cassian's voice darkened. If they cannot get either, they will settle for your death. Mara backed away from the desk. The wedding ring pressed into her finger like a shackle. You knew, she said. You knew Theo had done this. I found out after. Did you kill him? The question hit the room with the force of another gunshot. Cassian's expression went empty. Any other man might have looked offended. He looked almost approving, as if he preferred anger to tears. No. But you hated him. Yes. And you're a criminal. Yes. And now I'm supposed to believe you're the only man telling me the truth? No, he said, stepping closer. You're supposed to survive long enough to decide who lied better. Mara's back touched the bookshelf. Cassian stopped a breath away. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His presence trapped her more completely than hands. You will stay here until I know who inside your husband's company is selling your location, he said. My location? Today's shooter knew where the cemetery sniper position would be, knew your exit route, knew which gate had the weakest sight line. How do you know that? His gaze held hers. Because I would have chosen the same one. Fear moved through her, clean and cold. You're not comforting. I'm not here to comfort you. Then why are you here? His eyes dropped for 1 second to her mouth, not with softness, but with a kind of restrained fury at himself. To keep the last thing Theo protected from being destroyed. Mara could not speak. Something in that sentence hurt more than the footage. The last thing Theo protected, not his company, not his money, her. That night, Mara tried to leave through the kitchen door. She made it as far as the courtyard before 3 motion lights blinded her, and a guard appeared beside a fountain with the tired patience of a man who had expected this. Mrs. Dumaine, he said, please don't make me call him. Mara clutched Cassian's coat around her shoulders. She had meant to abandon it in the library. Somehow she was still wearing it. I'm not a prisoner. The guard's eyes flicked to the cameras. No, ma'am. Then move. I like breathing, a voice behind her said. Matteo is very attached to breathing. Mara turned. Cassian stood beneath the balcony, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his tie gone, tattoos visible on his hands. The rain had stopped, leaving the courtyard glossy beneath the moon. He looked less like a businessman now, and more like what he was. A man built by violence, dressed in civilization. You named your guard Matteo? She asked, because fear made strange things come out of her mouth. He came with the name. I want to go home. No. You don't own me. No, Cassian said. But they own the streets between here and your front door. My house is all I have left. You have a shipping empire. I don't want it. People will kill you for it whether you want it or not. Her anger broke. Then let them. Her voice cracked, and she hated him for hearing it. I am tired. My husband is dead. I buried a stranger today. I don't know who he was. I don't know who I am now. And every time you open your mouth, you take another piece of my life away." Cassian said nothing. The silence stretched. Mara looked down, ashamed of the tears she had sworn not to shed in front of him. Then his shadow moved closer. She expected command, coldness, another order. Instead, he said, "Theo used to sleep on the docks because he hated the group homes." Mara lifted her eyes. Cassian was looking past her, at the fountain, but his voice had shifted into memory despite himself. He was 12. I was 14. He stole bread from the riverboats and told me he had bought it, because pride matters when you have nothing else. One night, a man from Varro's crew cornered him for stealing. I hit the man with a broken oar. Theo laughed for 10 minutes while we ran. Mara barely breathed. "That was before Rafael died?" she asked softly. Cassian's jaw tightened. "That was when I still believed boys like us could grow into decent men. What happened?" His eyes came back to her. For a second, the courtyard felt too intimate, too quiet. Rainwater dripped from the balcony between them. She was wearing his coat. He was speaking in a voice no one else had heard in years. Then the iron gate at the far end of the courtyard exploded inward. The world became headlights. Mara screamed as a black van rammed through the side entrance. Guards shouted. Glass shattered. Cassian reached her in 2 strides, caught her around the waist, and drove her behind the stone fountain as bullets ripped through the courtyard plants. His body covered hers. "Eyes on me," he ordered. "I can't. Eyes on me, Mara." She looked at him because his voice left no room for panic. His face was inches from hers. Calm, focused, deadly. One hand held a gun now, the other braced beside her head against the stone. His sleeve had torn, revealing more ink, more scars. "You are going to crawl to the kitchen door when I move," he said. "No." His eyes sharpened. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered, shocked by herself. Something dangerous passed through his expression, not tenderness, not yet. Possession, recognizing itself. "Do not say things like that to me," he said. "Why?" "Because I believe what I want to believe." Then he rose and fired back. Mara crawled through broken glass, heart hammering, as Cassian's men closed around the attackers. She reached the kitchen, but when she looked back, she saw him standing in the courtyard rainwater, white shirt streaked with blood at his shoulder, utterly still, as one of the attackers dropped his weapon. Cassian did not kill him. He walked toward him with terrifying calm, crouched, and gripped the man's jaw. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood. "The widow signs by midnight, or she burns." Cassian looked toward Mara. Their eyes met across the ruined courtyard. For the first time, she saw fear in him. Not for himself. For her. By dawn, the mansion had become a war room. Men came and went with encrypted phones. Maps of the port spread across the library table. Security footage looped on screens. Every exit was reinforced. Every window became a threat. Mara sat in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, refusing the doctor Cassian had summoned. "It's just a cut," she said when he glanced at her hand for the 4th time. "You're bleeding through the cloth. You're bleeding through your shirt. That is different. Because you're made of marble? Because I've been shot before." She stared at him. He seemed to realize that was not reassuring. A gray-haired man named Enzo cleaned and stitched Cassian's shoulder while Cassian read messages with one hand. No anesthesia, no flinch. Mara found it unbearable. "Doesn't it hurt?" she asked. Cassian did not look up. "Yes." "Then act like it." His eyes flicked to her. For reasons she did not understand, that almost made him smile. Enzo tied the bandage and left them alone with the maps. Mara stood and approached the table. "If Celeste Varro wants my signature, what exactly does she need me to sign?" Cassian slid a document toward her. A transfer agreement. It would sell Dumaine Maritime to a holding company she controls. And if I refuse, she will challenge the will, threaten the board, kill loyal employees, leak stories about Theo's criminal ties, and eventually stage your death as grief-driven suicide. Mara's skin went cold. You say that like you've watched it happen. I have done worse for less. She appreciated that he did not pretend otherwise. Her eyes moved over the port map. Terminals, warehouses, private docks, shipping lanes crawling like veins through the city. What was Theo trying to do? Cassian's hand stilled. Mara looked at him. He didn't leave me this because he thought I wanted money. He left it because he wanted something stopped. Cassian studied her with a new expression. Not suspicion this time. Calculation edged with reluctant respect. He discovered Celeste was moving people through the port. Mara's breath caught. People? Women, migrants, debtors. Anyone who could disappear inside a container and be worth more alive elsewhere. The room seemed to narrow. Mara thought of Theo coming home late, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. She had thought he was tired. She had rubbed his shoulders. He had covered her hand with his and said, "If anything happens to me, don't trust beautiful people." She had laughed. Now she wanted to scream. He was trying to stop trafficking? He was trying to hand me the proof, Cassian said. We were supposed to meet the night he died. You hated him. I still came. Why? Cassian looked away. That answer cost him. Because before he betrayed me, he was my brother. Mara stepped closer to the map. Then we finish what he started. No. She blinked. No. You will stay alive. I will handle Celeste. I own the company. You do not understand this war. I understand people are being moved through docks with my name on the paperwork. His eyes hardened. Your name is why you are a target, and your fear is why you think locking me in a mansion is protection. The air tightened. One of his men shifted near the door. Cassian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Careful, Mara. No. You brought me here because you needed my signature. You just need it for a different reason than Celeste. His face went still. She had hit something. Theo left the Empire to me, she said slowly, understanding as she spoke. But you need me to authorize access to the sealed terminals, don't you? You can't get the proof without me. Cassian's silence answered. Pain moved through her before anger could cover it. You lied by omission. I kept you alive. That's not the same as telling me the truth. No, he said. It is more useful. She slapped him. The room froze. Cassian's head turned slightly with the impact. No one breathed. Outside the library windows, rain began again, tapping the glass like nervous fingers. Mara lowered her hand, shaking. Cassian slowly looked back at her. There was no rage in his eyes. That was worse. There was hunger. Not soft, not romantic. Something darker. The reaction of a man who had spent his life surrounded by obedience and had just been reminded what truth felt like when it struck him. He stepped closer. Mara refused to step back. If anyone else had done that, he said quietly, they would regret having hands. Then punish me. His eyes dropped to her mouth again, lingered, and rose. I am. How? I am letting you keep thinking you hate me. Mara's breath caught. Before she could answer, his phone rang. He listened for 5 seconds. His face changed. What? Mara asked. Cassian looked at her with the cold focus of a man choosing violence. Celeste has your sister. Mara had not spoken to her younger sister in 6 months. Lena Bell was 23, impulsive, brilliant, and unforgiving. She had hated Theo from the beginning. Not because he had been cruel, but because he had appeared too suddenly, too smoothly, too eager to marry her sister. Lena had said, men with secrets always call them privacy. Mara had called her dramatic. Now Cassian's men played a video on the library screen. Lena sat tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned ballroom. Her mascara was smeared. A bruise marked her cheek. Beside her stood a woman in an ivory suit with silver hair swept into an elegant knot. Celeste Vero looked like she belonged on a museum board, not in a hostage video. Mara, Celeste said, smiling gently. I am so sorry we have to meet this way. Grief makes people unreasonable, and Mr. Moretti has always had a gift for making women believe captivity is care. Cassian's face remained expressionless. Only his hand flexed once at his side. Celeste continued. Sign the transfer documents tonight at St. Aurelia's Hotel. Publicly. Cleanly. Your sister goes home. Refuse. And I will send her to your husband with my apologies." The video ended. Mara could not move. Cassian turned to his men. "Find the room. We're running architecture now," Enzo said. Mara grabbed Cassian's arm. "She's not part of this. They made her part of this." "You can get her back?" "Yes." "How?" His eyes were merciless. "By giving Celeste what she thinks she wants." "No." Mara shook her head. "You said if I sign." "You won't sign. You will pretend to." Mara stared at him. "You want to use me as bait. I want to use her arrogance as a door. That is my sister. And you are Theo's widow," he snapped, his control cracking for the first time. "You think I don't know what she took from you? You think I don't know what it means to have someone used against you?" The room quieted. Mara saw it then. Not just anger. Memory. "What did Celeste take from you?" she asked. Cassian looked away. Enzo spoke when Cassian would not. "His name." Cassian's gaze cut to him. Enzo lowered his eyes, but he did not apologize. Mara looked between them. Enzo's voice softened. 15 years ago, Celeste Varro backed the massacre at Delacroix Wharf. Rafael Delacroix was supposed to die there with his father's men. Theo helped pull him from the river. Then he gave the world a body and a lie. Mara turned to Cassian. "You weren't betrayed," she whispered. "He saved you." Cassian's jaw tightened so hard it looked painful. "He let me believe my sister died because of him." "Did she?" Silence. Mara stepped closer. Cassian's eyes burned. "My sister disappeared that night. Theo swore she was dead. Years later, I learned Celeste had taken her." Mara's hand went cold. "Is she alive?" "I don't know." The words were almost nothing. They were also the most human thing she had heard from him. Cassian turned away before she could reach for that wound. "Prepare the car. Mara wears white." She blinked. "White?" His gaze returned to hers. "If Celeste wants a widow signing away an empire, we will give her a widow no one can stop looking at." St. Aurelia's Hotel rose above Canal Street, like a cathedral built for sin. Gold light poured from its arched windows. Valets moved beneath red awnings. Reporters gathered behind velvet ropes, their cameras flashing as black SUVs lined the curb. A charity gala was underway, the kind of event where criminals wore tuxedos and philanthropists wore diamonds bought with blood money. Mara sat in the armored car wearing a white silk dress Cassian's people had somehow found in her exact size. It had long sleeves, a high neckline, and elegance so severe it made her look less like a bride and more like a verdict. "I can call a ride share," Grace said. Roman's expression did not change. "You can." That bothered her more than it should have. "You chose this dress to make a point," she said. "Yes." "What point?" His gaze finally turned. In the dim car, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not. They moved over her face, her throat, the white silk, the wedding ring she had refused to remove. "That Celeste buried you too early." Mara's breath caught. The car stopped. Before she could open the door, Cassian caught her wrist. "Not tight, just enough. When we go inside, you stay within 3 steps of me. I thought I was bait. You are also the only person in that room I will not allow to bleed." The possessiveness in his voice should have angered her. It did. But beneath it was something that made her pulse answer. "What if I run?" "You won't. Because you'll stop me? Because your sister is upstairs." That was cruel. True. Effective. Mara leaned closer. "I still hate you." Cassian's eyes lowered to where his thumb rested near her pulse. "I know. Does that bother you?" "Yes." The honesty disarmed her. Then the door opened, and the world exploded into camera flashes. Cassian stepped out first, then offered his hand. Mara stared at it. Every reporter watched. Every guard watched. Somewhere inside that hotel, Celeste watched too. Mara placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with controlled possession, warm and steady. Cameras flashed harder. "The widow!" someone shouted. "Mrs. Dumaine, are you selling the company?" Mr. Moretti, are you protecting her or controlling her? Cassian did not answer. He led her through the reporters with the calm of a man escorting a queen through enemy fire. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers blazed over a sea of black tuxedos and jeweled throats. Music played softly from a string quartet. People turned as they entered, whispers spreading like spilled wine. At the far end of the room, Celeste Varro waited beside a table, with legal documents and a fountain pen. In person, she was more beautiful and more terrible. Her smile held warmth the way a snake holds sunlight. "Mara," she said, "you look just like grief should look, expensive and obedient." Cassian's hand tightened around Mara's. Mara squeezed back once, not for comfort, but warning. She could speak for herself. "Where is my sister?" Mara asked. Celeste sighed. "Direct. I see why Theodore liked you." "Do not say his name." Something flickered in Celeste's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or irritation. "He was a romantic fool," Celeste said. "He could have had ports, power, protection. Instead, he chose redemption. Men who choose redemption always require women to mourn them." Mara stepped forward. Cassian moved with her, shadow and blade. "You killed him," Mara said. Celeste smiled. "I corrected him." The room seemed to breathe in. Nearby, phones rose. Cameras. Public scandal forming in real time. Cassian noticed. Mara saw him notice. So did Celeste. "Sign," Celeste said softly, sliding the papers forward. "Your sister lives. You walk away rich. Mr. Moretti can return to pretending he is not still that drowned Delacroix boy begging the river to give back his dead." Mara felt Cassian go utterly still. There it was. His real name without saying it. His grave opened in public. Mara looked at him. His face was cold enough to fool everyone else, but she stood close enough to feel the violence locked inside him. For one dangerous second, she thought he might ruin the plan and kill Celeste in front of 200 witnesses. So Mara did the only thing she could think to do. She reached up and touched his cheek. The entire ballroom froze. Cassian's eyes snapped to hers. Her hand trembled against his skin, but she kept it there. "Rafael," she whispered, too low for anyone else. "Not yet." His composure cracked again. Only for her. Only enough that she knew he had heard the name not as a wound this time, but as an anchor. He closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, the monster was back under control. Mara turned to Celeste, picked up the pen, and signed the first page with a false signature Enzo had taught her to make 30 minutes earlier. Celeste leaned in. At the same time, Cassian's phone vibrated twice. "Signal found." Mara signed the second page. Above them, on the mezzanine, a waiter dropped a tray. That was the signal for everything to go wrong. The lights cut out. The ballroom plunged into emergency red. People screamed. The quartet stopped. Armed men moved from the walls, not Cassian's. Celeste had known. Celeste had always known. Cassian grabbed Mara and shoved her beneath the table as gunfire shattered the chandeliers. Crystal rained down like ice. Mara screamed her sister's name. Cassian covered her head with his body as bullets punched through the tablecloth. His mouth was against her ear. "Do you trust me?" "No." "Good. Trust what I do next." He pulled her up and ran. They moved through smoke, screams, and red light. Cassian fired once, twice, never missing, never slowing. Mara clutched his hand as they burst through a service door into a dark hotel corridor. Behind them, men shouted. Ahead, an elevator opened. Lena stumbled out, barefoot and terrified, pushed by Enzo with a gun in his hand. "Mara!" Mara broke from Cassian and caught her sister so hard they nearly fell. For 3 seconds, the world was only Lena's sobs and Mara's hands on her face, her hair, her shoulders. Then Cassian said, "Move." They ran up, not down, because downstairs was death. Through a stairwell, into a private penthouse corridor. Sirens wailed far below. Somewhere beneath them, Celeste's perfect gala collapsed into chaos. On the rooftop helipad, rain whipped sideways. A helicopter waited, with blades turning. Mara shoved Lena toward Enzo. "Get her out!" Lena grabbed her. No, you come with me. Mara looked at Cassian. He was watching the stairwell door. She goes first, he said. Cassian. His eyes cut to hers. The name sounded different now. Too public. Too small for what stood between them. Mara swallowed. Rafael. Lena stared at her. Who is Rafael? Cassian's face changed, but he did not correct her. Go, he ordered. Enzo pulled Lena into the helicopter. Then the stairwell door burst open. Celeste stepped onto the roof with 2 men and a gun pressed to the temple of a woman Mara had never seen before. The woman was in her 30s, thin, pale, with Cassian's green eyes. The roof seemed to vanish beneath him. Cassian whispered, Isla. His sister, alive. Celeste smiled through the rain. Family reunions are so moving. Cassian raised his gun. Celeste pressed hers harder into Isla's temple. You shoot, she dies. You move, she dies. Mara signs the real transfer, or both women die. Mara's heart pounded. Lena screamed from the helicopter. Cassian looked at his sister, and for the first time, Mara saw him helpless. Not weak. Worse. Divided. The man who could choose violence against anyone could not choose which woman to save. Celeste knew it. Mara knew it. And in that terrible second, Mara understood why Theo had left the company to her. Not because she knew ports, because she was invisible to people like Celeste until it was too late. Mara stepped away from Cassian. His head turned sharply. Mara. She ignored the warning in his voice and walked into the rain. Celeste's gun shifted toward her. Mara Dumaine, Celeste said, finally behaving like a widow. Mara lifted the unsigned transfer documents she had grabbed from the ballroom table in the chaos. You want these? Yes. Then let them go. Celeste laughed softly. You have no leverage. Mara held the papers over the edge of the roof. Below, Canal Street flashed with police lights and news vans. Phones pointed upward. The whole city was watching now, drawn by the gunfire, the scandal, the gala guests spilling into the street. Actually, Mara said, voice shaking but clear. I do. Celeste's smile thinned. Mara looked down at the cameras, then back at her. Theo built a dead man release into the company archive. If I die, if I disappear, if my biometric access stops for more than 24 hours, every shipping ledger goes public. Names. Routes, payments, containers, buyers. Celeste's eyes flicked. Mara had guessed. Cassian's face told her she had guessed right. Theo had not only made her owner, he had made her trigger. You're bluffing, Celeste said. Maybe. Mara's grip tightened on the papers. But you killed my husband because he stopped being useful. Do you really want to gamble that he didn't learn from you? For the first time, Celeste Varro looked afraid. Only a little. Enough. Cassian moved like darkness given purpose. A shot cracked. Not his. Enzo's. From the helicopter door. Celeste's gun jerked away from Isla. Cassian fired once, taking down the man beside her. Mara lunged toward Isla and shoved her down as the second man fired. Pain tore across Mara's side. She fell hard onto the wet rooftop. She heard Cassian say her name, not as an order, as if the word had been ripped out of him. Then the world became rain, rotor thunder, and his arms around her. Mara, his hand pressed to her side. Look at me, she tried. His face hovered above hers, no longer cold, no longer controlled. There was blood on his cheek, rain in his eyes, terror where power used to be. Is Lena safe? She whispered. Yes. Your sister? Yes. Celeste? His jaw hardened. Behind him, Celeste Varro knelt on the rooftop, disarmed, surrounded by men and cameras from neighboring towers. Her perfect suit was stained with rain and blood. For a woman who had lived above consequences, public exposure was its own execution. Cassian leaned closer, pressing harder to Mara's wound. You do not close your eyes, he said. She almost smiled. Still giving orders? Always. Rafael. His breath caught. Mara lifted a trembling hand and touched his face the way she had in the ballroom. This time, he did not freeze. He covered her hand with his and held it there. "Do not use that name like goodbye," he said. "It's not goodbye. Promise me." She stared at him, at the feared mafia boss who had locked down her husband's funeral, stolen her from grief, lied to protect her, used her, saved her, feared for her, and now looked as if he would tear the city apart if she stopped breathing. "You don't get promises from me that easily," she whispered. A broken sound left him. Almost a laugh, almost pain. "That is my Mara." The last thing she remembered before the helicopter lifted was Cassian holding her against him, as if all his power meant nothing unless it could keep her alive. Mara woke to the sound of rain against glass. For one gentle, impossible moment, she thought she was home. She thought Theo was in the kitchen burning toast. She thought the nightmare had ended before it began. Then she opened her eyes. She was in a private room with ivory walls, tall windows, and monitors beeping softly beside her. Not a hospital, exactly. Too quiet, too expensive, too heavily guarded. A man sat in the chair beside her bed. Cassian. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled, one hand bandaged, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He was asleep upright, which somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. Like even unconscious, he was prepared to wake and destroy something. Mara watched him. His hand rested inches from hers on the bed. Close, but not touching. Even asleep, he had stopped himself. That undid her more than if he had taken her hand. She moved her fingers and touched his. His eyes opened instantly. For 1 second, he did not speak. He only looked at her as if confirming she was real. Then he leaned forward. "You're awake. You look terrible." His shoulders dropped slightly, relief moving through him in a way he could not hide fast enough. "You were shot. Grazed," she corrected, because she had learned from him. His mouth tightened. "Do not borrow my bad habits. Where's Lena? Safe. Angry. Eating all of my chef's food. Isla?" His eyes changed. "With her. They've been talking." Mara nodded, then winced. Cassian's hand hovered over her side and stopped before touching. "Pain?" "Some. I'll call the doctor." "Wait." He stopped. Mara looked at him. "What happened to Celeste?" "Arrested publicly. Her political friends are pretending they never met her. The port ledgers have already reached federal investigators, 3 newsrooms, and 1 archbishop with a talent for guilt." Despite herself, Mara smiled faintly. "Theo's dead man switch? Real. He trusted me. Sloth." Cassian's gaze softened by a fraction. "Yes." The word hurt. He did not try to make it hurt less. For a while, they sat with Theo's ghost between them. Then Mara asked the question she had feared since the cemetery. "Did Theo betray you?" Cassian leaned back slowly. The rain painted shifting shadows across his face. "He lied to me," he said. "For 15 years, I believed he abandoned my sister to save himself. I built an empire on that hatred. Because grief without a target becomes weakness. And now I know he traded his life for mine twice. Once at the wharf. Once when he left you the company." Mara's eyes burned. "He should have told me." "Yes. So should you." Cassian accepted that without defense. "Yes." She turned her head toward the window. New Orleans shimmered beyond the glass, washed clean and still wicked underneath. "I don't know how to grieve him now," she whispered. "I loved the man who made me coffee and left poems in the margins of my books. I don't know what to do with the man who owned ports and lied about everything." Cassian's voice was low. "Both were real. That doesn't make it easier." "No." She looked back at him. "You never say comforting things. I have very little practice." Clearly. This time, he almost smiled. The silence that followed did not feel empty. Mara studied his face. The fatigue he allowed only because she was too wounded to run from it. "What happens to me now?" His eyes sharpened slightly. "You recover. Then, you decide what to do with the company. And if I sell, sell. If I burn it down, I'll bring matches. If I leave New Orleans." The room changed. Cassian's expression did not move, but the air tightened around him. "There are safer cities," he said. "That's not what I asked. He looked at her hand near his. For a moment, the feared man returned, controlling, possessive, built to claim what he wanted. Then something harder happened. He restrained himself. "If you leave," he said quietly, "I will make sure no one follows." Mara's heart twisted. "Would you?" His eyes met hers. No. The honesty should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the truth after days of beautiful lies. He continued, voice rougher. "I would want to. I would put men in every airport and every street. I would sit outside whatever house you chose until you hated the sight of my car. I would tell myself it was protection." His hand curled into a fist. "But I would not cage you again." Mara stared at him. There it was. Not softness, not redemption wrapped in pretty words. A dangerous man, choosing, with visible effort, not to turn love into ownership. That was the first moment she trusted him. Not completely, but enough to move her hand over his. His fingers went still beneath hers. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said. "I know. I'm not ready to stop grieving him. I would never ask you to. I'm not ready to belong to anyone." His eyes darkened. "Good." She blinked. Cassian leaned closer, his voice low enough to touch. "When you come to me, Mara, it will be because you chose to. Not because danger chased you. Not because grief broke you. Not because I locked the doors." Her breath caught. "And if I never come?" Pain moved through his eyes, immediate and hidden too late. "Then I will spend my life making sure the world is safe enough for you to refuse me." Mara closed her eyes against the tears. "That sounds like devotion." His thumb brushed once across her knuckles. Barely a touch. Almost nothing. From him, it felt like a confession. "It is not a safe thing from me," he said. "I know. You should be afraid. I am." His gaze held hers. "And yet," Mara opened her eyes, "and yet I'm still holding your hand." 6 weeks later, Theo Dumaine was buried again. Not in the public cemetery where bullets had interrupted prayer, but in a small private plot beneath an old live oak overlooking the river. No reporters, no crime families. No false mourners in black suits pretending loyalty to a dead man they had planned to rob. Only Mara, Lena, Isla, Enzo, and Cassian. This time, the coffin was already sealed in earth. This time, white roses lay across the grave, without blood or rain. Mara stood before the headstone, with Theo's journal in her hands. The city hummed in the distance. Barges moved along the Mississippi. Somewhere beyond the bend, the ports were being audited, seized, cleaned, or fought over by men who had never imagined a widow with ink-stained fingers would become the most dangerous signature in New Orleans. Mara had not sold the company. Not yet. She had created a trust instead, locking the legal terminals under federal oversight and using Theo's remaining clean assets to fund shelters for people who disappeared between paperwork and profit. Lena called it reckless. Cassian called it strategic. Enzo called it expensive. Mara called it breathing. She opened Theo's journal to the final page. The letter inside was short. "Mara, if you are reading this, I failed to tell the truth in time. I loved you badly, because I loved you with secrets, but I loved you honestly, in every place I knew how. Rafael is alive. If he comes for you, fear him. Then listen. He has become a monster, but monsters are sometimes what wounded boys build to survive. Do not give him your trust easily, but if he earns it, he will protect what he loves until the world ends. Forgive me only if you want to. Live either way. Theo." Mara folded the letter with trembling hands. She did not cry the way she expected. Her grief had changed shape. It no longer swallowed the whole sky. It stood beside her, quieter now, asking to be carried instead of obeyed. Cassian waited several feet away, giving her space because she had asked for it. That mattered. After a while, Mara walked to him. He was dressed in black, as always, but there was no armor in his posture today. Only restraint. "Did you read it?" she asked. "No." She held out the letter. He looked at it, but did not take it. "Was it for me?" "Part of it." His eyes moved to hers. Then you can tell me if you choose. Mara smiled faintly. You've been practicing. Painfully. She gave him the letter anyway. Cassian read it once. His face did not change until the last line. Then something behind his eyes gave way. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone who did not know where to look. But Mara knew now. He folded the letter carefully. He always did know how to make forgiveness inconvenient, Cassian said. Mara laughed softly, and the sound surprised them both. The river wind moved between them. Cassian looked at Theo's grave. I hated him for 15 years. I know. I don't know what to do with the absence of that hatred. Mara reached for his hand. This time, he let her. Maybe you don't have to fill it immediately. He looked down at their joined hands. The dangerous man. The grieving widow. The dead brother between them. The city waiting beyond the cemetery, with all its sins still breathing. You are not staying in the mansion, he said. It was not a question. Mara raised an eyebrow. Are you ordering me? No. His mouth curved slightly. I am informing you that I have accepted your refusal before you give it. Very mature. I hate it. I'm staying in my own house. I know. No guards inside. His expression darkened. Cassian. His jaw flexed. Outside. Across the street. Next door. Across the street. A pause. Both. She narrowed her eyes. He looked almost innocent, which on him was absurd. Mara shook her head, but she was smiling. Then she turned toward the river. You can come for dinner. Cassian went completely still. Such a small invitation. Such a dangerous silence. When? He asked. Tonight. What should I bring? Nothing illegal. That limits me. Try. His eyes warmed in a way that would have terrified anyone else, because it revealed nothing soft had replaced the darkness. The darkness had simply chosen her as its direction. Mara stepped closer, not close enough to kiss him, close enough to make the almost matter. Do not mistake dinner for surrender, she said. Cassian lowered his head, his voice a quiet promise against the river wind. I would not dare. For a moment, they only looked at each other. No gunfire, no locked gates, no lies moving faster than love. Just two damaged people standing between a grave and a river, trying to understand what could grow in ground soaked by betrayal. Then Cassian lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Slowly, reverently, not claiming, asking. Mara's breath trembled. When he released her, the place his lips had touched felt warmer than the rest of the world. They left the cemetery together as the sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet tombs gold. At the gate, black SUVs waited. Mara stopped. Cassian glanced at them, then at her. With a sigh that sounded almost human, he opened the passenger door of his own car, instead of directing her to the armored convoy. Mara looked inside. No driver. No guard between them. No locked partition. You're driving me home yourself? She asked. Yes. Am I allowed to choose the music? His expression tightened with theatrical suffering. I am devoted, not defenseless. She laughed again. This time, Cassian smiled. Not the cold imitation he gave enemies. Not the dangerous curve he used in rooms full of liars. A real smile. Brief. Beautiful. Devastating because it belonged to Rafael, the boy buried under all that power, and to Cassian, the man who had survived him. Mara slid into the car. Cassian closed the door gently. Across the cemetery, Theo's white roses stirred in the wind. And as the Mafia boss drove the widow back into the city that had tried to own them both, Mara watched New Orleans unfold through the windshield, dangerous, wounded, glittering, alive, and felt, for the first time since the funeral, that the next chapter of her life had not been stolen. It had arrived in black, carrying white roses, and this time she would choose what name to call it.